Well, good morning. So just want to introduce myself and my wife. I'm Jay Fuhrer, a longtime conservationist, worked out of the Northern Plains for 40-some years. My wife Kathy is with me. We're heading for 50 years of marriage here in August, so we're hoping we can make it that far yet and see how that goes. So all that aside, happy to be in Kansas. It's warm here. We live in a little different climate than you do, but the soil health principles are universal. And so I think what we'll talk about today is some of those aspects, and we'll cover a number of items. And so to kind of put this a little bit in perspective, I'd spent 40 years or so with USDA as a conservationist, and I was the monitoring guy. So when we moved into cropping systems that were different, like we moved from tillage systems to no-till systems, well, what did that do to the carbon? What did that do to soil aggregation? What did that do to the dynamic soil properties? What happened? And so I monitored those things. When we moved into the grazing systems, what happened when you go from season-long grazing to short-duration grazing, to rest recovery? When we moved into gardening, what happened, what was different in the gardens when we made changes in the gardens and changes in high tunnels? Those type things. So the people in my group that did monitoring, we had a saying: if you don't really want to know, don't look. Because it's not always the way you think it's going to be, right? It's a learning process. Nature is extremely connected. I'm going to show you something that, this is how I started, okay? If you dropped it on your foot, you'd probably break your toe, right? It's very dense, it's very compacted. There's virtually no pore spaces in here, all right? This is my today's work, okay? I took this from the Menoken Farm, I think Friday afternoon, because I said, I'm going to Kansas, I got to take some soil along. Tell me what's different between them. Describe them. Tell me a difference. Color. Wow, why is one darker than the other? Carbon. The color, what's the color of coal? What's the color of oil? Yeah, so when we bring more carbon into a soil, the soil darkens. When we take more carbon out than comes in through the carbon cycle, it lightens. And the carbon is the food. So if you don't have enough carbon coming in, the biology can't build the aggregates fast enough. And your soil collapses and gets harder. And we don't like hard soil, right? You know, if you're building a road or a dam, this is for you, right? This is what you want then. You don't want water coming into it. But if you're gardening or cropping or any of those, you want something that is very friable, as the soils people would say, very friable, crumbly, right? You want the carbon. If you have carbon in your soil, the biology has their food supply, and they build aggregates. Because this particular soil is very crumbly. I can just real easily crumble it. And so I always say the difference between North Dakota and South Dakota, there isn't much. But the difference between them is South Dakota has Mount Rushmore, North Dakota has the oil. There's your big differences, right? So we have the carbon, because the Bakken oil field, when that was created, the general area of North Dakota was near the equator. So we're talking geological time, right? So it was near the equator. And so it formed that. And now we reap the benefits from it millions and millions of years later. So with that, I'm going to step into things. Let's take a look here. That's the Menoken Farm. In the indigenous language, it means you reap what you sow. So it kind of pays a little honor to the local indigenous tribes in Northern Plains. So we're going to talk about reference materials, quotes, geology, high tunnel structure, light meters, water, which is so important, soil, pH, minerals. Minerals, if we could just eat soil, we don't need these plants, right? We could really bypass this thing if we could get the minerals directly, right? just doesn't work quite as good. So we end up going through plants and animals to obtain them. Lots of different ways, but it comes down to these minerals. Carbon, I want you to understand, after this morning, I want you to understand those 4 parts of carbon. If you understand them, you will do well, and you will understand why you want some of these different plants and why you want cover crops. You will know why. It's not just you read that it's a good thing. I want you to know why. Compost, all kinds of it, cover crops, mulches. Mulches are a big item. I like food type mulches. I like paper. I like cardboard because they become food. So those are good things. Plant diversity, rain garden, bioinoculants, food quality, bricks. If we only get through 1 of them, fine. If we get through 2 of them, fine. If we get through 10 of them, fine. You got them all on your program. I fought the battle ahead of time. I've never been good at fighting a battle the day of the battle. Okay, reference materials. So, books. I love to read. Carrots love tomatoes. That's a good one for companions, a good starter for companion planting. I've read that book 2-3 times. Regarding minerals, I like the Regenerative Grower's Guide to Garden Amendments, Nigel Palmer. It's a good book, and he really explains it well in terms of minerals in these plants and how to extract them with fermentation. Puts it to you in a recipe form, writes well. He's the former NASA retired employee, kind of went down the gardening soil health road and does a great job on this. Here's another one, The Ideal Soil. If you got no life, this is for you, right? Yeah. So that's a good one. By no means an inclusive list. There's so many. When Weeds Talk is good. Nature and Property of Soils by Brady and Weil is good. So that's my old college textbook. That's version 14. When I was in college, it was 8. And I also sentimentally got number 1. So I have them all 3. There's 14, but I have the first and I have the one that when I was in college, it got a little beat up because I actually used it. And this newer one, Dr. Weil actually signed that one for me, so that's kind of cool. But all these books are good. Knott's is a great handbook for the technical information. Anything about carbon, you can just look up Don Rykowski. He's the old retired soil scientist out of Morris, Minnesota. Spent his career on carbon. He's really good. He's still alive, and he's still actively engaged. Back in the days, what I would have called a true gentleman. You know, just one of those kind of people. So if you want to know carbon, there's your guy. Anything he wrote, it's stellar, you know. And then everything I'm going to talk about today is right out of Menoken Farm. Okay? So we set the stage now. Soil contains microbes. Humans contain microbes. We are so connected. Most of our cells are what? Microbial, right? 90% of our cells are microbial. They're really small cells, but we're mostly a walking, talking microbe. We don't like to think of it always that way, but we are. Anything by Aldo Leopold, the oldest task in human history is live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Why is that always so tough? Because farming, gardening, it's an extraction business. And what are you willing to put back? What are you willing to do differently? And then No Free Lunch in Nature by Dr. Lael. We had him as a speaker in the Northern Plains a couple winters ago. Also very good carbon person, but it really speaks to everything is connected in nature, and we are part of nature, and we're all connected. So when we do something, the impacts go through everything. And once it's in our food production system, guess what? It's in there. And so we have to understand, have some idea what we're doing, and really motivates us, I think, to grow food for our own families. And so I think that's a huge item. Okay, so also I want you to think about a statement for your purpose of your business, whether it's an outdoor garden or a high tunnel or a greenhouse or a farm or whatever it is. This is a friend of mine. He has a great garden. He put together his statement why he does it. It's his goal, why he does it. And he's got some tremendous reasons why he does it. It's things like healthy supply of food for family, friends, and community. Well, that's pretty hard to beat, right? That's pretty noble. I've worked with clients all my life, and I work with you if you're willing to put a statement together. If you won't put a statement together for me, I'm not going to work with you because I can't read your mind. And so if you put together some kind of statement, I don't want to be a pen pal with you, but if you can't do a paragraph or two for me, then you don't have an investment in it. And so I always ask for that. First half of my career, which was pretty sad, I didn't ask for things like that. But second half of my career, when I started looking at how do you build this thing back, then I started asking for those type things. Okay, so he has this purpose, just an illustration, think about that. Put something together, and you need to put it together with everyone who's invested in it. So it's not just you alone. You know, it needs to be the group. Okay, little on geology. Everyone needs an elevator speech. So one of my elevator speeches, right, when you get the opportunity and you get 2 minutes with somebody that can make a difference, our law, rock, life, air, and water, that's where this all started. And the soil is the intersection of rock, because all these minerals came out of rock. Everything started with rock, and we had to eventually, I'm talking geological time, eventually had to turn that to soil. And the biosphere was life, was plants, animals, microbes, all that had to get at it. And then the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, everything that's in it. And then the hydrosphere, as far as water and dissolved substances. Where's the intersection? Well, it's the soil. Everything intersects. Are we old? Well, the first microbial communities, yeah, we're talking billions, right? Plants aren't as old. Plants are a little younger. Microbes go back a long, 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 long ways. How about people when they looked like today? That was only 200,000 years ago. So you start thinking about this, we're pretty new on the scene. So do you think we know a lot more than this group up here? Who runs your emotions, who runs your physical well-being, everything inside you? We all have a few pounds of microbes in us. Without it, we couldn't absorb lunch today. We couldn't do it. So who's running who, right? Kind of makes you wonder, okay? And so you start looking at all these things and you start to understand that how insignificant your time on earth is in terms of the big picture, if you will. So this is the Menoken Farm high tunnel, nothing fancy, pretty straightforward. So this one's just 48 by 24 by 11, you can have any size. And we usually have a shade on it because we grow a lot of really hot producing crops like cucumber and tomato, but we also grow a lot of cooler crops. So a lot of times we have a shade on it. And the shade is kind of interesting because it also helps us with hailstorms, which we are prone to. And hailstones just bounce off of that. The plastic underneath is fine. So that made an interesting scenario. Now that one's called 50%. So 50% reduction. And I'm like, yeah, right, sure. How do they know that, you know? So of course, in my little world, I went and got a couple meters here. And you're welcome to look at any of these things anytime today. But I've got 2 meters here, one for UV and one for PAR, photoactive radiation. Okay, that's the photosynthesis, right? And UV is the ultraviolet. And so this plastic is treated, so there should be a reduction in ultraviolet. I put a shade on, there should be a reduction in photosynthesis, right? And so you look at those, so these are things you need to know if you have or are moving into one of these. So you look at PAR, so I took these readings. So I had 518 PAR inside the high tunnel, and outside of the high tunnel I had 1,079. Whoa, that's about 50%. So that kind of made sense, right? Now if I reduce that too far, I can't grow these warm season crops to maturity very well. So there's a word of caution, right? So it makes a big difference, and you're going to put a shade on. Great for growing the cool season crops, but cucumber, tomato, etc., they want that full heat, right? So it's always a balance. What about the UV? Well, inside it was 13, outside it was 70. Slight reduction in UV, which we know because if that plastic isn't treated, it gets brittle the first year. It isn't going to last very long. And so that typically is done. But every time we do something in nature, it's all connected, right? And so now that changes some things. So I'm not going to go into detail on this, but the PAR, ultimately the PAR is just a number. It's the wavelength 400 to 700 nanograms, and it reads from 0 to 1999. But ultimately, we want to take that number and we want to plug it into a little calculator like this to get daily light. So we want the daily light, and we're looking at, what is it? DLI right there. And so then we have a number that we can look at a crop and know if we got enough light coming in there to do a good job on it. Okay, these little calculators are available online, but when you get a meter, it's just going to give you that 0 to 1999 number. You actually have to plug that number into that little calculation, and then you'll get DLI, and you got a usable number. So a lot of you know this already, but if you go down that road, that's where you want to be. Of course, you can get your DLI and you can start looking at the maps. Big difference in November between our light in North Dakota and your light in Kansas. We can't do much unless we add supplemental light. We have to have grow lights. If we don't have grow lights for about 3-4 months during the winter, you aren't going to do much. There isn't that much light. Why do you think there's, I was going to almost say something terrible like, why do you think there's all that alcoholism in the Northern Plains? I'm going to skip that one. So the UV, think in terms of navigation for insects. So when you take the UV out and your goal is you want insects in your high tunnel, it gets tougher, right? Because you just took and reduced the ultraviolet rays tremendously. And so you start looking at all of these items, but this is how you can do this. What I really like about these meters is they just have on, off. On, off. That's all that's on there. And then you hold it and it will give you the reading. That's wonderful, right? That's a keeper, right? And they aren't so horrible for expense. So just stepped into those recently and just started using them last summer. Okay, water. So water quality gets really important in the high tunnel, in an inside garden, in a greenhouse. And so this was my start, my first year. And didn't go well. This is how things looked. I'm embarrassed by the photo because it's bare soils. I don't like bare soils. I need some cover on the ground, okay? Because if I don't, I get some issues. Salinity being one of them. So my water was an issue and I could tell on the plants right away. So we were working out of a well and I sent it in to Minnesota Valley Testing. Dissolved solids for 2290. Knott's handbook is going to tell me you should get below 480. That's a big difference. In other words, you're not going to use that water the way it is, right? So I switched it. Sodium was at 680. We need to get below 70. So that water is not going to work, right? And so I made that mistake on purpose so I could go to Kansas years later and tell you that, you really need to test that water when you start, especially if you're going to start new. You really need to test the water. Water quality is such a huge item. So after that, we went to rainfall runoff. Okay, so I use the rainfall runoff, and if I run out of water, because sometimes we're not all that heavily on rain, and if I run out of water, I got backup with city water now. And so it's not my first choice, but the rainfall water, I love it. So that really works well. Now, I want you to think about water. What are these little drops here? What is that? Yeah, that's guttation water. Okay, that's not dew. So when you're really early in the morning and you're walking through an outdoor garden or you're walking through a cropland field and you are observant, you will find these drops of water. So remember when you were in school and you learned about the phylum, the phloem and the xylem? Remember that? And you were so excited to go home and tell your parents? Remember that? Okay, that was just a joke. That was a little too quick for you maybe. Okay. So what happens? What happens on this? So the xylem, at night the stomata closes. And if you got a little bit more water in the soil, it's going to push the water up the xylem. Xylem only goes one way. Remember, phloem flows all over the place, but xylem only goes up. Okay? So it pushes water up and it comes out of the hydathodes. So if you look at a larger vegetable, you can physically see those on the edge of a plant. So they're going to come out there. And that's the primary water source for the insect world. So they're going to use this plant juice, if you will. Primarily water, but there's also other things in it as well. And so that's one of your things that you want to take a look at. And you want to say to yourself, well, if I put on an insecticide or if I put something systemic on, yes, it's going to come out directly there, okay? And so consequently, that gives us an understanding of what we're putting into the system. Transpiration is what we really are after because we want water to go through the plant. So transpiration, yeah, that's okay. Guttation, also if you're inside watering in a high tunnel or in a greenhouse and I get a lot of this, maybe you're overwatering, right? Because it's pushing that water out. And so it's kind of an indicator in more than one way. But if you got average or a little wetter conditions, expect to see some. And of course, evaporation. Evaporation is the nemesis because you aren't buying anything. Transpiration is building soils, it's doing all these things because it's supporting the plant. Evaporation is water leaving a bare soil. And when you do that, so in our world, we were underwater millions of years ago, we have geological salts. If we continue to evaporate, we leave the salt on the surface. You do that 1 year, no big deal. You do that 2 years, no big deal. You do that 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, all of a sudden you start to see these little salt crystals on the surface. And you drive through North Dakota cropland today, you might see 5% of those acres not growing a crop. And so that's salinity. Salinity occurs with too much evaporation, not enough transpiration. Okay? Cover crops fix a lot of that, but then what's your goal? You got to want to do it. Remember the parents giving you the talk about wanting to do something and having to do something? Remember that talk? Okay. Soil health principles, I worked on descriptions. I didn't write those principles, but I worked on descriptions of those principles to describe the principle and how to put it in your neck of the woods. So if you're going to use those 5 principles, they are on your drive, your USB drive. But if you decide to use them, you should rewrite the descriptions for you, for your watershed, your situation. So what's in a typical soil? 45% typically is in mineral form of sand, silt, and clay. That was formed geologically. Remember our law? Started with rock. And then 25% air, that's in the pore spaces. 25% water, again in pore spaces and soil organic matter. And 5% soil organic matter. We're in Kansas, right? So you're all 5% plus. Is that right, Troy? Okay. Okay. So, gives you an idea, right? And the atmosphere, we're mostly nitrogen and oxygen, heavy on the nitrogen, right? And then small traces of a lot of other things, right? But you got it all on your drive, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. You can read that at your leisure, okay? So what happens when I don't disturb the soil? So if we can, this is one of the principles, if we can minimize disturbance, and all 3 of these, they all 3 had compost applied to them. They're all 3 cropping systems. This one had no disturbance for 35 years. This one did, minimum, did though. And this one over here did have tillage. Well, they all look pretty good up here, right? But one of them went deep, right? The other thing that it did is you start looking here and you see that it has openings going up and down, not horizontal. And we want the up and down scenario. That's how a root operates. And we see the carbon went deep. It'll go as deep as the root can go because the root's going to give off the exudates. So this one with the window there might not show real well, but I brought 3 Bismarck State College. It's a small community college. I worked with them a bit and they said, we need some soil for the students. I said, I'm your guy. And I said, I'll put 3 fields side by side together. And I had them on the kitchen table and I said to Kathy, I said, look at the difference of these 3. This one on the left, no cover crop. This one in the middle had a single species. This one on the outside right here on the far right had a multi-species cover. Can you see the difference in color? There's an old saying with the soils people, plants fix dirt. They hate the word dirt, right? Soil scientists don't like that word dirt. That's why I always use it, because it keeps them going, right? Keeps them going. So this is what it looks like when I take, I got 2 really great soil tools. This is sieves, okay? You have to have a budget to have this. If you don't have enough budget where you can get your pieces of plastic and some screen, then you can't afford this. But I've got enough budget to do this. So this is a 1 millimeter and a 2 millimeter sieve. And you take your soil and you put the 2 on top of the 1, And then, as we would say in North Dakota, you shake the bejesus out of it, okay? And you will get these little perfectly formed aggregates that will look like that under the microscope. So they're all uniform. Now you can do water stable aggregates. I can put them in a little distilled water, give them a few minutes, they dissolve. That field's got some issues. Doesn't have enough glues to hold it together. If they stay stable, they are then water stable aggregates. You've reached utopia, right? So these are actually from a farm in Kansas I worked on a couple of years ago, and did a great job. I mean, that was just stellar. They just stayed in that water and looked at you. You know, they were that stable. So that's a really good indicator. And I like to do things that don't cost me anything, because I spent my career with the end gate of a pickup down at the end of the field and a spade. And I want to do it there. And I want that client with me. This is just an indicator. I don't have to spend any money on it. And I can do it there, just like with the spade. So we have vests also. You can just print that out of off the internet. It's a VESS. It'll be on your drive. But that's how you can tell if your soils are good or not. It goes from 1 through 5. 1 is good. I can tell you right now, this is what you're looking at for a 1. This is what you want. You want it very crumbly, easily crumbles, right? This is a 5. Very difficult to break with your hand, with your thumb and your finger pushing together. You really can't break it, okay? So that's a 5. And this is just a simple item that you can see and feel. If you can see and feel. Again, I like things that don't cost anything, and you can do right there. This is one that works that way. And you can just print out that one page. It's front and back. It's a real brief description. But 1s are utopia and highly porous, very easy to break. 5 is pretty much the opposite. Extremely blocky, massive, can't break them, nothing good's going to grow in them, and then everything in between. And you find your way on that. And you can rate yourself, rate your garden or your field, your cropland field or whatever. So I just go ahead and I put them in little containers like this, and go ahead and I assign a number like I have. I also sieve them, and I know exactly where those fields are. It didn't cost me anything. So things you can do if you choose to. If you do them as a group, they're easier, right? If you do them with a bunch of you together, they're easier. Especially if you got somebody in the group who's done it before, then it gets to be fun, right? So the O horizon, we used to talk about that, and then one day we didn't. But the O horizon was what built our soils geologically when we were all grass or trees, forest and prairie. They all had an O horizon, the organic matter, the organic layer. And so it was the cover on the soil. Another reason I brought this along, guess what it has on the surface? It has an O horizon on the surface, okay? And so what happens is it feeds the soil downward as it decays. And each year you add to the organic layer, the O horizon, and each year some of the older stuff feeds the soil. And it builds it, and it starts to look dark. Whatever you put on it grows, okay? Now I can cut this off with my knife, and if I do that, it's best not to have such a dull knife, but I can just lift it up then. I can just lift it up. So sometime during break or ever you come up here, after I lift it off and I look at it, well then it's just soil with no cover. Now you're starting the topsoil part, okay? But there should be an O horizon. At one time there was. If I go on to a lot of our cropland soils now, I don't find an O horizon, or if I do, it's really weak. If the person's using cover crops and some of those techniques, you're going to probably find a little bit more of an O horizon, okay? But that should be there. We should have cover. So this is one I took, and that's what it looked like. And I took my knife and I cut across it. You can just, like a hinge, right? Right there, you can just see the top of that soil. And here I just took the top off, and then you just got bare topsoil. Right? And then the topsoil starts, the A horizon. This is the start of one that I was working on that's had kind of a tough life. And you see these horizontal lines? That's what happens with the soil. I don't care if you're in Kansas or North Dakota or where you are. If you don't have enough carbon coming in and you have too much disturbance, you will get this horizontal layering. That's the soil aggregates collapsing. and they collapse into like sheets of paper. Now, when you build it back, then it's kind of like an accordion, right? It can open up again, but you got to build it back, right? And soil health principles would do that for you. But that is a classical look, and see how this root mass on the corn plant, how it's starting to grow out horizontal, because it has difficulty going down. Yes, sir.
So that poses a question I often have. The core sampling methods that you've shown pictures of and everything show a very vertical stack within the soil. What's really happening under there? The roots aren't growing one taproot straight down. The roots are growing out. Is the impact as the soil changes? Is it spreading out as it goes deeper?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So fibrous roots build aggregates. So if you want to build aggregates, you're going to have some fibrous root. Okay, so, but we don't have much fibrous root anymore because of I'm talking cropping systems now. So now in the northern plains, we grow corn and beans. Sometimes we grow beans. Okay, no fibrous root. So back in the day when we had wheat, malting barley, those type things in our crops, they built the aggregates. So it depends on what you've been growing, but this particular one, corn doesn't build a lot of aggregates, it builds some. None of these crops are evil, but when you start putting them in with repetition too frequently, then we start to lose the ability to build it because we have to have a fibrous root to build the aggregate back. Same way in the garden. So when your garden season is over, put in a grass type cover because it's fibrous and it'll build the aggregates back. And so it's very specific to what you've been growing. Yeah, it's a great question. There you are. There's the fibrous. That's the one that'll build the aggregates back right on the root system itself. That's a cover crop. But you want multi-species because every one of them gives a different exudate, and we're going to touch on that in just a moment. Wanted to touch on pH too. So if you have a high tunnel or you have a greenhouse or you have an outdoor garden, very specific to soil pH. And so usually 6.5 to 7.5, well, if you take a look at what's available nutrient-wise, right around 6.4, 6.5 is pretty much utopia if you're looking at pH between the acidity and the alkalinity. So the lower you go, the more acid, the higher you go, the more alkaline. 0 to 14. Now, ideal soil says the ideal soil pH is 6.4. I like a range like this one, 6.5 to 7. You can live in there real easily, okay? And then if you want to lower it, these are the items you can look at on your drive. I even put in some smaller things like white vinegar, coffee, and these get mixed with water. Coffee grounds are okay, but the coffee itself is much lower pH. So coffee would work in your flower pot or your garden, mix it with some water. You also, if you are raising pH, so you're too low, that would be our normal situation in North Dakota. So we are rather acidic, so we're going to be working in this arena more, okay? And usually lime, because it adds the calcium, is what's going to be used, and there's lots of lime sources. What do you have? Our lime source is sugar beet production, so we're going to get lime from the beet plant. They're probably not even going to charge you because they might want to get rid of it, but transportation is going to kill you, okay? And so, but in a garden scenario, and I'm going to be doing that this spring, I'll probably take a look at some coffee or vinegar because I have some that are up around 8+ now, so I need to make a change on those, okay? Gypsum is a good product too, but it doesn't really alter pH much, not directly. More soil structure. So gypsum is going to add calcium. It's going to help disperse some of these tight particles if that's an issue with you, right? But a lot of that depends on what your goal is. There's also a lot of other ways to do soil pH. I've got pH meters along. I got pH strip along. You can just take a pH strip. So there's lots of different ways you can do this, okay? I want to talk a little bit about minerals. Anybody remember C.B. Hopkins Cafe closed Monday morning and night, see you Zoom the management? Anybody remember that? No? Okay. Well, it was in your textbook in college. So there's about 92 minerals. So when you start talking minerals, it's good to maybe think about this a little bit. So what mineral starts with C? Carbon, boron, hydrogen, and potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, calcium, iron, chlorine. Yeah, chlorine is a big one, right? It's actually there, right? What's Mn? No, manganese. What's Mo? Molybdenum. What's Ni? Nickel, right? Who gets this one? Cu. Copper. See how clever they are? So Cu is copper. Zn is zinc, manganese. Okay, so that's 17. You're going to find places that'll say 16. You'll find places that might say something different. Don't worry about that. This is pretty much the group that's going to end up in a plant. If you could eat them directly out of a soil, great. But you can't too much. You can a little bit. So this is a good way for you to be thinking about. Those are 17 out of the 92. Those are the ones that I gotta know if I have. I gotta get them in me, right? Somehow. So you start looking at that. There they are. They're macronutrients, they're micronutrients. They're positives, they're negatives in terms of cations and anions. But the main thing is, do you know what they are? Or do you have a good way to recall them? And you can look at that CU Zune, right? And it really helps you remember them, right? Because they aren't that difficult. So a lot of times clay colloids, they have a negative charge. Soil organic matter has both. Let's put this in perspective. If I add soil organic matter to my garden, it's a big plus, right? No pun intended. But there's a plus and a negative comes with it, so I can secure a lot of things in terms of nutrients, right? I got both charges then, right? And so when you go to the western part of the U.S., we don't have much clay. Western part of the U.S. has more sand and gravel, all right? So they are younger geologically than the eastern half of the U.S. Why? Planet was all kind of at the same time, but why? Eventually they'll become clay geologically. Why? Rainfall. Rainfall is one of the big items, right? Because you need that. Every time it rains, there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and it forms this carbonic acid. So all rain is kind of acid rain to some degree. To some degree it is. And that's what degrades everything over slow time. So eventually deserts will get some clay in them. We won't see that, but eventually that'll happen. We are older in the eastern part of the U.S. From a soils viewpoint. Now, this one, you don't need to read this one, but it's in Nigel Palmer's book, and what he did is he took the weeds and fermented them. So you ferment them into a liquid. Now you broke them all apart. Down to a liquid. That plant is down to a liquid, nettle and dandelion and all the ones he did. Then he sent them in for analysis. And then you start looking at what it did, and I'm not going to go in, but just as an example. So lamb's quarter only had 5 parts per million calcium, but nettle had over 800. Yeah. So you start to see, ooh, those weeds just pull up a plethora of different minerals. And they are mineral accumulators, right? They are trying to heal you. And you are going to fight them tooth and nail, right? You're going to throw everything at them. And you start looking at what they're doing. They're going deep, and they're bringing minerals back that aren't there now. Okay, so we need to start to understand that concept a little bit. But they're mineral accumulators. So if you decide to read his book, how he does it, takes that material, ferments it with sugar into a liquid. And then you can use that liquid in your garden. So an oversimplification, take some tomatoes and you ferment them. Now the minerals are in balance to what a tomato already likes. So the next year he can use that to grow tomatoes. So this guy sat up at night thinking way too long, right? Right? I mean, that's pretty ingenious. And all those minerals, when I was in college, out of those 17, you know which one we spent the most time on? Nitrogen. Everything revolved around nitrogen. You know what one of the simplest ones to use is? Nitrogen. I mean, you know the one we probably should have been looking at? Calcium. That's the one we should have been looking at. And we should have connected it to our health and said, here's why we need this. Because we don't function without it. Okay? Nitrogen's an easy one. That's different. Okay? So you get the gist of what's in his book. And he's got all these formulas, all these recipes. So this is the one I'm going to do. I'm going to do this one for the first time at the Menoken Farm this spring, ferment plant juice. And it's a pretty simple process. And you don't need a lot of it when you're done. You know, if I can get a quart or two of liquid, and I'll send it in for analysis, and I'll record it, and it has long shelf life. And then I can put it on the shelf and use it in my garden. How's that for crazy? Then I grow multi-species cover crops. I will ferment them later in the year, and I will send it in for analysis, and I will know what's in those, and it will have long shelf life, and I will use it to grow plants in my garden. Okay, is that crazy enough for you now? But anyway, that book is well written, and what I like about it, if you did anything in life, you probably stood on someone's shoulders, because somebody figured something out, and you used it, and it worked, and it helped. And he basically got this concept from a lot of the Korean work, and so they've gone down that road a long time ago. But he put it into kind of a US format, if you will, recipes that we understand and relate to, and the how-to part. Okay? These are all in his book. All these recipes are in his book. And these are all different things you can do to ferment. And you can get minerals or you can get biologicals, right? So you can get them right in your own garden and with weeds and materials that you have locally. Carbon, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between sequestration and stewardship. We need to get over this sequestration thought that is totally absorbed this country, and we need to be thinking about stewardship. And they're totally different, okay? And I think the stewardship is what you get when you look at the entire carbon cycle and you understand the importance of the whole cycle versus bringing it into one area and thinking you're going to contain it there. There's a difference, okay? It's meant to cycle. So if you read that document, that's your homework. That's a great article. It's on your drive. When you get to that page, you look it up. It's a really good read. It's well written, and I think you'll enjoy reading it. Dr. Jansen did a wonderful job on it. You can tell by the quote here how some of the words are written. It's a Canadian article. It's very good. Okay, so when we want soil organic matter, well, it starts out in this labile portion right here of living organisms and biomass. So green plants, living biology, that's the first one that it does. And then it processes it into dead tissue and dead microbes. So that becomes part of the process. This takes a little time. And then the third portion is the very dead, and we want to get it to this humus portion to get some a little more stable. Well, that stable part breaks down into humic and non-humic. The humic portion, the polysaccharides, a lot of cellulose, plant cell walls. Okay, this smaller portion here, 20 to 30%, and then the chitin becomes insects and crustaceans, you know, that hard shell. So that's where this 20 to 30% is going to go, but the 60 to 80% continues to go down into insoluble and soluble. The soluble part, fulvic acid and humic acid. There's a lot of material on that. That's the end of the decomposition trail. When you get to that, it doesn't break down any further. Okay, you're to the end of that trail. Now, fulvic acid, you're typically going to be something that benefits plants. When you hear fulvic acid, think plants. That's what's going to benefit a plant. And there's going to be, the soil food web is not real resistant. It isn't real resistant to the soil food web. They're definitely going to consume that. There's a little resistance to it, but not a lot. Humic acid, you're going to benefit the soil. So if you put humic acid in, think soil. And cation exchange capacity and pH. So cation exchange capacity is the ability of the soil to hold and transfer nutrient. So those are important items. So if you're going to use those, think of those two. And then the third one, this is the one that all the attention goes to, right? We're going to sequester. Don't even like that word a lot because I like stewardship better. But we're going to sequester. We want it in this humus form on the lower left here, right there. And so it's the soil food web. It says it has great resistance. If you have great resistance to the soil food web, why would you? Why does it have great resistance? It's stable, but why? They've eaten every last thing out of it already. It's all about food, right, Margit? It's a lot about food, so it becomes stable because they just can't really eat anything left out of there anymore. They pick around on it yet. Because like it says, it has great resistance. Well, not total resistance. They're still going to work on that. But humic acid, fulvic acid, if you're going to use those, have some understanding. One's more for the soil, one's more for the plant. They're great products, but they're at the end of the decomp trail, right? So when you let residue deteriorate on your soil surface, you're doing that in a less concentrated manner. This would be a very concentrated manner. Like if you bought some of that material, if you bought fulvic acid or humic acid, that's very concentrated. It took a lot of material to decompose down to make that, right? Makes sense? All right, so let's talk about these 4 parts of carbon. So if you take a corn plant, whether it's sweet corn or field corn, there's 1/3 of the carbon in the grain, there's 1/3 of the carbon in the plant, and there's 1/3 of the carbon in the root mass. Okay? So we start to understand that. That's where those 3 parts of carbon are. And so the 4th part talks about the exudates. So root exudates, 30 to 40% of this carbon scenario during the summer is going to be an exudate. So let me show that. First 1 to 2 months of a green plant's life. That's when it's going to give you the exudates, the sugars. The sugars are going to go into the soil. So this year, when your corn is maybe V6 or so, you know, it's getting up about maybe close to 3 feet high, go ahead and dig up a plant. Nip off the ends of the plump looking roots. They'll be a little yellowish. And you can wash them off if you want to. And chew on that. What are you going to taste? Sugar. The purest sugar taste you've ever tasted. Okay? That's the exudate. You are consuming carbon exudate, the sugar. That happens in the first 1 to 2 months. Eventually that quits, and the plant reverses that flow of energy because it wants to make what? It wants to make grain. So it needs that energy going up to the upper part of the plant. Okay? Does that make sense? But the first 1 to 2 months, so you see why putting a cover crop in, I've only got 4 or 5 weeks left of growing season. Should I put a cover crop in? Absolutely. You'll get the exudates. You don't need a big biomass of growth on top. You need the root mass. So 1/3 in the grain, 1/3 in the residue, 1/3 in the root mass. And then when it's 1 to 2 months old, it'll also give you the root exudates. So you need to understand that. So another thing that I like to do is I'll put a cover crop in the high tunnel in one of the beds, and I will nip it off with my loppers 2-3 times during the summer and make it regrow. What am I doing? Yeah, every time I'm forcing that plant to give me another shot of exudates. So I'm manipulating it much like livestock, cattle would have done on the prairie. Because when it regrows, you're probably going to get some sugars again. So that's cheating a little, right? And I like that kind of cheating. Yeah. Okay, so just to give you an example on the pH, these are my raised beds. See how these are totally off the ground. There's no soil all the way to the ground. On this side, I have soil, they're lower beds. They're both raised a little bit. This one's raised up for old men, and this one not as much. But the pH is real high. So the pH on the raised beds right here is 6.8. So these are 6.8. I can live with 6.8. That's pretty darn good. Okay. What about these lower beds? Ooh, 8.2. Huh. What's going on? I put soil and compost in those 10 years ago. I just recycle everything. But the pH dropped on these lower beds, not on these beds. Huh. What's going on? Why is that? Say again?
You said they were 8.2, so they got higher on the, you had said they dropped.
Oh, I'm sorry. So those rows, okay. Glad you caught that.
From the soil underneath it?
Yeah, you're on the right trail. Drainage. So when these drip lines are on and somebody sees the water starting to come out of the bottom of the bed, they shut it off. You get a little leaching. That's more like with no cover on. That's more like having rain, okay? Here, that doesn't happen, all right? Also, I got fatty clays under here, so the drainage is poor, okay? really showed up over time. And so now I need to do a little adjustment on these bottom beds. So these are real heavy clays. If it's just a regular clay, wouldn't be so bad, but these are fatty clays. And so there's just nothing goes through them. So when I put these in, I cheated. I got to be honest with you. I drilled 3 holes in each of these, and like a post hole, digger hole, and then I backfilled them with gravel because the fatty layer was 20 inches. Okay, so I drilled through, backfilled it with gravel, but even that wasn't enough. I still got caught with the pH. I thought I was so smart that day, but I wasn't. You know, nature is so connected, it still figured me out. But there's a difference between something that leaches and something that doesn't. And the same way across this country, east to west. So soil organic matter got affected. The raised beds are 6.5, the lower beds are 3.6. That's a big difference, right? So the raised beds, everything got affected. When the pH went south, everything got affected. Soil organic matter level dropped. My vegetables aren't near as good here as they are in these raised beds. So now I got to make a little correction, which I will. It's never static. It's nature. It's never static. So you can see it's pretty much off the chart on most items. I just recycle, recycle, recycle. There's no commercial fertilizer used in there. I just recycle it. When I put those beds in, I used 1/3 compost, 2/3 soil mixture. And I put those beds in. I put them in twice. I put them in about 11 years ago, and I had a Tordon residue carryover. So I took them all out by hand, and I put them all back in again. So now they've been in 10 years. And so it really showed what the difference was on the pH. Okay, so we're going to take a little break right there.